Welcome back. President Trump instructed his acting attorney general to reclassify state-licensed medical marijuana as a less dangerous drug last week.
Though cannabis sales were legalized in Nevada years ago by a statewide vote, it remains a Schedule I narcotic on the same level as methamphetamine and heroin. That's according to the Nevada State Board of Pharmacy. Fox 5 reached out to the board to see if it will be changing its scheduling of the drug. They tell us if the federal government does officially reschedule a controlled substance, it automatically triggers a state law. That law states that 60 days from publication of a final order of rescheduling, if no objection is made, the board shall adopt that change. The ACLU of Nevada previously sued the Nevada State Board of Pharmacy, claiming they should follow state law and lower the classification of the drug as Nevada voters made sales legal in the state, as it has real-world impacts on Nevadans. And coming up tonight at 10, how reclassification could help make cannabis businesses throughout Nevada safer.